My name is Michael Harding, and until recently, I believed that my life was built on a solid foundation of trust and shared dreams. I remember the early days with Emily, the way her laugh filled our modest apartment, the warm comfort of her hand in mine as we strolled through the park, and the promises we made about a future together. Now, those memories seem like echoes of a life that was slowly disintegrating long before I even noticed the cracks. It started with small signs, almost imperceptible at first. A delay in her evening call when I expected her voice to greet me after work, an unfamiliar scent lingering on her clothes, and a hesitancy in her smile that I couldn't quite place. I tried to dismiss these warnings as mere coincidences, remnants of busy days and the natural ebb and flow of a long-term relationship. But as weeks turned into months, my intuition grew louder. I began to see the subtle changes in her behavior, the way she avoided discussing her day, the secretive glances at her phone when I entered the room, and the growing distance between us during dinner conversations. I remember one rainy Thursday evening when I came home early from work, hoping for a quiet night in. The apartment was unnervingly silent, and I found Emily in our bedroom, engaged in an intense conversation on the phone. Her voice was low and urgent, and as I stood in the doorway, the conversation abruptly ended. The sudden awkward silence that followed spoke volumes. I felt a rush of disbelief and hurt surge through me, yet I couldn't bring myself to confront her immediately. Instead, I retreated into a state of internal turmoil, questioning every smile and every kind word that had once meant so much. For days, I wrestled with a storm of emotions, anger, sorrow, and a deep sense of betrayal. I found myself rereading old messages, searching for hints that I had missed. I combed through our shared photos and mementos, trying desperately to find the moment when everything began to fall apart. Each discovery felt like a betrayal all over again, intensifying the pain. I was haunted by the thought that the woman I loved, Emily, who had once been my confidant and partner, had hidden this secret life from me. My mind became a battleground between denial and the unbearable truth. I sought solace in long walks along the quiet streets at night, where the darkness seemed to mirror the depth of my despair. With each step, I questioned not only her fidelity but also my own worthiness of love. I recalled the promises we made, the plans we sketched out for a shared future, and I felt an overwhelming sadness that the life I had built with her was crumbling like fragile sandcastles before an unforgiving tide. One particular evening, as autumn leaves rustled against the window, I found the courage to ask her directly. Sitting at our worn kitchen table, with the scent of coffee mingling with tension, I looked into her eyes, eyes that had once been so full of warmth and certainty. "Emily," I began haltingly, "have you been hiding something from me?" Her silence was deafening, and in that moment, the truth was laid bare without a single word spoken. Though she never uttered the confession outright, every gesture and every flicker of guilt in her eyes confirmed my worst fears. In the days that followed, I confronted her softly, trying to piece together a narrative that would make sense of the betrayal. Emily admitted to meeting someone else, a coworker, a man who had somehow filled the void in her heart that I, it seemed, could no longer satisfy. Even as I listened to her rationalizations, my heart broke further. I felt as if I was listening to a stranger recount a tale of infidelity rather than the woman I had shared my life with for years. I questioned everything. Was our love never as genuine as I had believed? Had I failed her in ways I could not comprehend? The revelation plunged me into an isolation that was as painful as it was profound. I turned to old journals and scribbled notes in the quiet hours of the night, trying to capture the tumult of emotions swirling inside me. I wrote about the love we once had, the betrayal that shattered it, and the future that now loomed uncertainly ahead. Each word on the paper was a cathartic release, yet it also marked the slow dismantling of the life I thought was unassailable. I began to retrace our steps, reflecting on every shared memory, every conversation that now took on new meaning in the light of her betrayal. I visited the places we once frequented, the little Italian bistro where we celebrated our anniversaries, the secluded lake where we had once confessed our deepest secrets, and each location seemed to echo with both joy and sorrow. In these solitary pilgrimages, I encountered both the remnants of our happier times and the painful evidence of a love that had been eroded by deceit. There was a time when I believed that trust was the unshakable foundation of any lasting relationship. Now, that trust lay in tatters around me, replaced by the gnawing certainty that everything I had known was built on fragile illusions. I wrestled with the duality of my emotions, the bitter resentment towards the woman I loved and a desperate, almost irrational longing to mend what had been broken. I wondered if forgiveness was possible, or if the damage was irrevocable. But deep down, I sensed that the path ahead was fraught with painful choices. Even as I contemplated the end of our once beautiful union, a part of me clung to the hope that things could be salvaged. I tried to recall the reasons why I had fallen in love with Emily, the compassion in her eyes, her quirky sense of humor, and the promise of a shared future. But those recollections were now tinged with the sharp sting of betrayal, each memory a reminder of what had been lost. In a desperate bid to reconcile my conflicting feelings, I immersed myself in the details of our past, analyzing every moment for signs of a hidden truth that could explain her betrayal. Yet, as I wrote these thoughts in my journal, a clear realization began to emerge: sometimes love is not enough to overcome the fractures that lie beneath the surface. The more I reflected, the more I understood that the person I thought I knew was a mosaic of contradictions, one that could not be easily pieced back together after being shattered. And though my heart ached for what we once had, I had to acknowledge that the time had come to face the inevitable truth. This chapter of my life, marked by betrayal and sorrow, is not just the end of a relationship, it is the beginning of a painful journey towards self-discovery and healing. I am left with the remnants of a love that once promised forever, now reduced to memories and questions that have no answers. The facade of our perfect life has crumbled, and as I stare into the dark abyss of an uncertain future, I cannot help but wonder if the pieces of my broken heart can ever be put back together again. For now, I must live with the knowledge that trust, once shattered, is almost impossible to restore. And while the echoes of our past linger like ghostly reminders of happier times, I stand at the precipice of a new, lonely chapter, one where the hope for reconciliation has been replaced by the inevitability of a hostile separation. The road ahead is murky and uncertain, but I know that every step I take will be towards reclaiming my dignity and finding the strength to move on. After that fateful confrontation, a heavy silence descended over our once shared home. The space between Emily and me was no longer filled with warmth or laughter but with an unbearable tension that seemed to vibrate with every unspoken word. In the days following our first raw confrontation, I found myself oscillating between a need for retribution and a desperate desire for closure, a reckoning that would finally force us to face the truth of our broken union. I spent many sleepless nights locked in reflection, trying to process how our relationship had deteriorated so drastically. The remnants of what once was haunted every corner of my mind. Memories of our shared dreams, whispered promises, and the delicate intimacy we once shared now morphed into painful reminders of the betrayal that had unraveled our bond. I felt an overwhelming mixture of anger, sorrow, and confusion, a cocktail of emotions that left me both numb and enraged. Unable to bear the constant turmoil of silence, I decided that the only way forward was to confront the situation head-on. I needed to know if there was any remnant of the love we had once nurtured or if everything had dissolved into a cold, indifferent void. With this resolve burning within me, I approached Emily one evening as she sat alone in the living room, her eyes distant and unfocused. I asked her, softly but firmly, to share her side of the story. I wanted to understand what had driven her to seek solace in another's arms, even if the answer would only deepen the wounds that already festered. Emily hesitated, her gaze dropping as if weighed down by the gravity of her own guilt. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled with remorse and regret. She explained how she had felt isolated and misunderstood, how the monotony of our routine had drained the spark from our relationship. She recounted the excitement of a new connection, a coworker named Daniel, whose attentiveness and charm made her feel alive in ways that I could no longer. Her words, though gentle, cut through me like a knife, each syllable reinforcing the painful reality that our love had been irretrievably lost. As she spoke, I could feel the raw emotions welling up inside me. There was a part of me that yearned to believe in her explanation, to hope that perhaps our fading connection was merely a symptom of the pressures of daily life. But as her narrative unfolded, the inconsistencies and half-truths became too glaring to ignore. The more she tried to justify her actions, the more I realized that the betrayal was not born out of momentary weakness but had been a gradual, calculated drift away from what we had built together. In the days that followed, I began to retrace the steps of our past, searching for any sign that could have foretold this rupture. I revisited the little moments we had shared, the spontaneous laughter, the midnight talks, the unspoken understanding that once bridged our differences. But now, these recollections served as cruel reminders of how deeply we had been deceived by our own illusions. The discovery of our mutual vulnerabilities and unfulfilled desires left me questioning everything I thought I knew about love and commitment. At the same time, a part of me became fixated on understanding Emily's transformation. I reached out to her close friends, hoping to glean some insight into the changes I had witnessed over the years. Their responses were a mix of sympathy and disbelief. Many confessed that Emily had grown distant, often retreating into herself as if harboring secrets too painful to share. Yet, none had anticipated the extent of her betrayal, and this collective shock only deepened my sense of isolation. With my emotions teetering on the brink of an abyss, I turned to the one place where I could attempt to find some semblance of control: the written word. I filled countless pages of my journal with the chaos of my thoughts, trying to document every nuance of my feelings and every detail of our unraveling love. Each entry was a cathartic release, yet they also bore witness to the gradual disintegration of the man I once was. In those pages, I found both the raw expression of my pain and the subtle seeds of my transformation, a transformation that would eventually lead me toward reclaiming my identity, independent of a shattered love. The confrontation with Emily had irrevocably altered the dynamics of our household. The air, once filled with shared routines and mutual support, now echoed with bitterness and regret. Every shared glance, every touch that once conveyed tenderness now sparked a burning reminder of betrayal. Our conversations had turned from hopeful plans of a shared future to bitter debates over accountability, leaving us both trapped in a cycle of resentment and sorrow. Despite the chaos, I resolved to find a way forward, whether that meant salvaging what remained of our love or accepting that some wounds were too deep to heal. I began to attend support groups and therapy sessions, where I learned to navigate the complexities of betrayal and self-recovery. These sessions became a lifeline, a place where I could express my emotions without fear of judgment. Slowly, I started to recognize that the pain, as excruciating as it was, also held the promise of growth and renewal. Yet, even as I embarked on this difficult journey towards self-healing, the shadow of our fractured relationship loomed large. Emily, too, appeared caught in a web of regret and confusion. Our attempts at reconciliation were marred by a mutual distrust that neither of us could overcome. Each effort to rebuild the bridge between us only served to remind us of the vast chasm that had opened up in its place, a chasm that seemed destined to widen with every passing day. One rainy afternoon, as I watched droplets race down the windowpane, I came to a painful realization. The person I once loved was irrevocably changed, and the love that had once bound us was now irreparably tainted by deceit. There was a moment of clarity amidst the chaos, a stark acknowledgement that sometimes, despite our best efforts, certain wounds cannot be mended. The understanding that our paths had diverged filled me with a quiet sorrow, one that signified the end of our shared journey and the beginning of separate roads. As the days turned into weeks, our home transformed into a battleground of conflicting emotions. Every argument, every tearful exchange, solidified the sense of inevitable separation. The unresolved questions, the lingering doubts, and the deep-seated hurt all pointed to a future where reconciliation was not just unlikely but perhaps impossible. The love we once cherished had been replaced by a bitter resentment that left no room for forgiveness. In this period of intense reckoning, I stood at a crossroads, torn between the remnants of our shared past and the uncertain promise of a future without Emily. The internal battle raged on. Part of me wanted to cling to the fragments of our former life, while another part insisted that we must part ways to heal and rediscover our true selves. The scales of trust and betrayal had tipped irrevocably, and the path to recovery lay in accepting that some relationships are meant to end, no matter how painful the separation. Now, as I reflect on those turbulent weeks, I realize that our encounter was more than just a confrontation. It was a mirror that forced me to confront the fragility of human connection. The reckoning was not simply about assigning blame or recounting the series of betrayals, it was about recognizing that our lives had been irrevocably altered by choices made in moments of weakness and despair. This painful truth set the stage for a future where the bonds of our marriage would dissolve into a hostile and irrevocable separation. In the weeks that followed the inevitable confrontation, our home became an arena of unresolved conflict and stifled resentment. I felt as if I were trapped in a slow-motion spiral, each day dragging me deeper into a pit of despair. The walls, once echoing with our laughter and shared dreams, now bore witness to bitter silences and hollow arguments. I found myself oscillating between numb resignation and a fierce determination to reclaim what remained of my identity, an identity that had been overshadowed by the collapse of a love that I once believed would last forever. During those turbulent days, my nights became battlegrounds for a relentless internal dialogue. I would lie awake in our darkened bedroom, the oppressive silence punctuated by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the adjacent kitchen, and replay every moment of our past like a broken record. It was as though every memory carried the weight of 1,000 disappointments, and I was powerless to alter the narrative that had been written by betrayal. I questioned whether the person I had once been, confident, caring, and whole, had been lost in the wake of Emily's infidelity. The man who had once looked at the world with hope and ambition now stared blankly at the ceiling, burdened by the crushing realization that nothing would ever be the same again. In an attempt to escape the pervasive melancholy, I sought solace in distractions that promised temporary relief but ultimately deepened the void within. I threw myself into work, spending long hours at the office where the steady hum of printers and the clatter of keyboards provided a false sense of normalcy. My colleagues noticed the transformation, a once enthusiastic team member now reduced to a shadow of his former self, mechanically completing tasks with a detached demeanor. The work that had once been a source of pride became little more than an escape from the relentless pain of confronting my personal failure. Outside of work, I took to wandering the city streets at night, as if the anonymity of the darkness could shield me from my own anguish. I would drift aimlessly, sometimes ending up at the park where I had once shared secret conversations with Emily under starlit skies. Now, those same trees seemed to whisper bitter reminders of what had been lost. The neon glow of the city lights offered little comfort. Instead, they highlighted the contrast between the vibrant life around me and the emptiness that had seeped into every corner of my being. Amid this descent into isolation, an unexpected turning point arrived, a brief encounter with a stranger who challenged the confines of my despair. One chilly evening, while I was aimlessly walking near a quiet cafe, I met a man named Jonathan. Jonathan, a gentle soul with a sincere gaze, noticed my somber expression and approached me with genuine concern. "You seem lost," he said softly, offering a kind smile that somehow cut through the darkness I had been enveloped in. At first, I was reluctant to engage, wary of the vulnerability that came with opening up to a stranger. But as we continued to talk, his words sparked something within me, a flicker of recognition that perhaps I had not yet surrendered completely to the bitterness of my circumstances. Jonathan spoke of his own struggles with loss and betrayal, recounting a time when he too had felt adrift in a sea of sorrow. His story was not one of redemption, but rather a candid acknowledgement of the pain that comes from trusting and then being let down. There was something profoundly honest about his admission, and as I listened, I began to understand that I was not alone in my suffering. His presence served as a mirror, reflecting back to me the fractured pieces of my identity that I had long since tried to ignore. In that moment, I realized that perhaps the descent I had been experiencing was not a final downfall but a precursor to an awakening, a painful, yet necessary, process of rediscovering who I truly was. Motivated by this unexpected conversation, I resolved to confront the inner turmoil that had been holding me captive. I started attending support meetings for individuals grappling with betrayal and loss, where I met others who had walked similar paths. In these gatherings, I found a collective strength in shared vulnerability. We traded stories of heartbreak and healing, and I slowly began to piece together a mosaic of resilience from the shattered remnants of my past. I learned that while the wounds inflicted by betrayal might never fully vanish, they could eventually serve as the foundation for a deeper understanding of myself and what I valued most in life. This journey of self-discovery was not linear, it was filled with setbacks and moments of overwhelming grief. There were days when the pain would surge unexpectedly, leaving me paralyzed with the haunting memories of what once was. I would catch myself staring blankly at photographs of happier times, each image a bittersweet reminder of a future that would never come to be. Yet, through it all, I began to recognize that the process of healing was gradual and that each small step forward was a victory in itself. As I navigated this treacherous path, I found solace in creative expression. I returned to an old passion, writing. I began to document my journey, not as a lament for what had been lost, but as an exploration of the intricate emotions that had come to define my existence. With each sentence penned, I reclaimed a part of myself that had been buried under the weight of sorrow. The act of writing transformed my pain into a narrative of growth, and in doing so, it offered a glimmer of hope that perhaps I could emerge from this darkness as a stronger, more self-aware individual. In the midst of this personal evolution, however, the inevitable truth continued to cast its long shadow. Emily and I found ourselves drifting further apart, our once intertwined lives now marked by a chasm too wide to bridge. Our attempts at reconnection were fraught with the echoes of past betrayals, each conversation a minefield of unhealed wounds and unspoken resentments. The remnants of our shared life, once a tapestry of love and trust, had become threads of bitterness, unraveling with every attempt to sew them back together. The turning point in our crumbling marriage came unexpectedly during a late afternoon discussion that began with cautious politeness and quickly escalated into a confrontation laced with anger and regret. The conversation, which I had hoped might lead to some form of resolution or understanding, only served to confirm the inexorable truth: the bond between us had been irreparably damaged. In that heated exchange, we both recognized that the future we had once envisioned was no longer viable. The love we had nurtured, despite its passionate beginnings, had withered under the strain of betrayal and mistrust. As I reflect on those tumultuous days, I realized that the descent into despair was not merely a consequence of Emily's betrayal, it was also a journey into the depths of my own vulnerabilities. The process of facing my pain, of accepting the loss of a love that had once defined me, was both harrowing and transformative. It forced me to confront the stark reality that sometimes, the path to self-discovery is paved with heartbreak, and that only by embracing the darkness can one truly appreciate the light that lies beyond. Now, as I stand at the crossroads of my own destiny, the awareness of the irrevocable changes within me offers both solace and sorrow. The man who emerged from the wreckage of our shattered relationship is not the same man who once believed in the sanctity of eternal love. I have been scarred by betrayal, but I have also awakened to the painful truth that growth often comes from the deepest wounds. With each step forward, I carry the lessons of my past, even as I prepare to sever the final ties that bind me to a love that has long since faded. As the days bled into one another and the taste of bitterness grew ever more acrid, I finally reached a moment and the remnants of our shared past could no longer be reconciled with the harsh present. The transformation I had undergone in the wake of betrayal had forged a man who was no longer willing to live in the shadow of Emily's deception. With a resolve hardened by sleepless nights, shattered dreams, and the slow erosion of trust, I prepared myself for the confrontation that would sever our lives permanently. It began on a cold, gray morning when the silence of our home had become too heavy to bear. Every room echoed with the ghost of our laughter, a laughter that now felt like an insult, a cruel reminder of a love that had decayed. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table that once witnessed gentle conversations and shared secrets, and found myself staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. It was in that moment that I realized that the time for tentative attempts at healing had passed. We had reached the point where even the possibility of reconciliation was nothing more than an illusion. Emily entered the room quietly, as if she too were trying to escape the weight of our reality. Her eyes, once filled with tenderness, now harbored a distant, almost hostile, glimmer. I could sense that she was steeling herself for what was about to come, and yet, there was no mutual understanding, only a shared resignation to the inevitable end. "We need to talk," I said, my voice lacking the gentleness it once possessed, replaced instead by a cold determination that had been tempered by months of heartache. Her silence in response was deafening. We moved to the living room, where the afternoon light cast long, oppressive shadows across the walls, and every object in the room seemed to bear witness to our mutual disillusionment. I began by recounting every instance of betrayal, every small sign that had eventually culminated in a chasm too wide to cross. I spoke of the late-night phone calls, the furtive glances, and the palpable distance that had grown between us. As the words spilled out, I could see the guilt and sorrow in her eyes, but also an embittered defiance that suggested she no longer felt the need to plead or justify. "Michael," she finally interrupted, her voice strained and laced with bitterness, "you always wanted to dissect every detail, to play the role of the victim. But did you ever stop to consider that maybe you weren't the perfect husband you thought you were?" Her retort cut through the charged silence like a shard of glass, forcing me to confront not only her failings but my own shortcomings. In that moment, I realized that our grievances were not one-sided, they were the product of years of unspoken resentment, unmet expectations, and mutual complacency. Yet, no amount of shared blame could undo the betrayal that had irreparably marred our trust. The conversation escalated quickly. Accusations flew like daggers, each one aimed at reopening old wounds. I accused her of deliberate deceit, of building a facade of love only to tear it down piece by piece. In turn, she lashed out with words that revealed her own suffering, expressing a long-held resentment towards a life that had become stifling and predictable. The intensity of the exchange was terrifying, a collision of two souls who had once been intertwined, now desperately grasping for a sense of self in the midst of chaos. Amid the flurry of harsh words and wounded pride, a realization crystallized in the back of my mind: this was not just an argument, it was the culmination of a long, agonizing process of disintegration. Every moment of denial, every false hope that reconciliation was possible, had led us to this final, irrevocable confrontation. There was no path back to what we had once been, no hidden reservoir of love that could be summoned to mend the rift. Our marriage had become a battleground of mutual recriminations, each of us entrenched in positions that left little room for compromise or healing. As the argument reached its fever pitch, I saw in Emily's eyes a mixture of fury and resignation, a silent admission that she too recognized the futility of our struggle. The air grew thick with the weight of unspoken farewells. The memories of better times seemed to mock us as we traded barbs that could no longer be taken back. I realized that the love we once nurtured had not faded gently into the night, it had been extinguished in a blaze of anger and sorrow, leaving behind only the smoldering ruins of a once promising future. In that final confrontation, I made the hardest decision of my life. With a voice trembling with a mix of finality and profound sadness, I told her that I could no longer live in a house filled with memories that hurt too much, in a home where every object reminded me of what we had lost. "Emily," I said, my tone cold and unyielding, "this is it. We've tried to rebuild what was broken, but every attempt has only deepened the divide between us. I can't pretend anymore that the past can be erased or that we can simply ignore the pain." Her eyes flashed with a defiant, yet broken, light as she realized that I was not willing to continue in this endless cycle of blame and regret. The finality of my words hung in the air, leaving a silence more deafening than any argument. It was a silence that spoke of irrevocable decisions and the end of shared dreams. In that moment, We both understood that our lives had diverged so completely that any attempt at reconciliation would be nothing more than a betrayal of our true selves. The love that had once united us was now a distant memory, a ghost that haunted the halls of our home. After that fateful conversation, the remaining fragments of our relationship began to crumble away. We packed our belongings in silence, each item a testament to the life we had once shared, a life that now belonged to the past. As I closed the door behind Emily on our last day together, the sound echoed like a death knell. It was a moment of hostile separation, a definitive break that left no room for second chances or reconciliation. Walking away from the life we had built, I carried with me a profound mix of relief and sorrow. The anger, the hurt, and the bitter memories would continue to linger, but I knew that the final break was necessary for both of us to begin anew. In parting, there was no gentle farewell, no quiet hope for eventual forgiveness, only the raw, unvarnished truth of a love destroyed by betrayal. And as the distance between us grew with every step I took, I felt both the weight of loss and the strange, liberating certainty that I was finally free from the chains of a relationship that had long outlived its purpose. Now, as I reflect on that final chapter of our lives, I recognize that sometimes separation is the only path to self-preservation. The journey ahead is daunting, and the scars of our shared past will undoubtedly remain. But in the hostile breakup, in the irrevocable parting of our ways, there lies a chance to rediscover who we are beyond the confines of a shattered union. The finality of our separation, though painful, is also a harsh but necessary reminder that some bonds, once broken, cannot be mended.